Yesterday, Merlin calling her disgusts me. My wife approaches me and tells me she is going on a date. I'm 33, a male, and Merlin, a 34-year-old female, and I are married for 6 years. We opted not to have children and live our life as a happy couple. Now, a few months ago, she began grumbling about how monotonous life has become and how it would be great if we had children. I said, "If you really want, we can talk about it. We still have time, I suppose." Then she changed her mind, saying it was only for the midlife crisis. I choked it up to her mood swings and moved on. Then yesterday, she revealed that she was going on a date with her colleague. A date. I believe she was toying with my brain. I laughed and replied, "You got me." She looked at me with wide eyes and answered, "No, I am dating seriously." I couldn't believe what she was saying. I mean, you don't expect your wife to come to you and say she's going to mess around with another man. Oh dear Lord. For almost 10 minutes, I believed this was a prank. I inquired why she was suddenly going on a date. She stated, this to break the repetitive rhythm. She wants to do something adventurous. So what was that? I'm going on a date with a colleague. She brushes it off, stating, it's not a big issue. It was only a supper. I just couldn't wrap my head around this information. She sat me down and said, remember when I told you that life has grown monotonous and that we needed to do something fun, but we couldn't figure out a solution? I interrupted her and told her that we had found a solution. We devised a new itinerary that included a weekly date night and a little vacation every 3 months. We did try a number of other things. You recommended, she stabbed me, and nothing about it seemed exciting. Then let me finish. So I was talking about this at work with my colleague, Randy. You recognize him, right? He chimed in, saying he was going through the same thing. He later approached me privately. We discussed this extensively. He too has tried many approaches with his wife, but none of them appear to be effective, exactly like us. So we decided to go on a casual date and see if there was any adrenaline rush. That is why we scheduled this supper. I inquired if she could hear herself. She asked, what's wrong with 2 people eating dinner? I inquired if it would simply be 2 people eating supper and nothing else. She said, yes, so why the heck are you calling it a date? You may just say you were going to dinner with a colleague. She exhaled, God, I wanted to be open with you. Who thought you'd act like this? We decided to call it a day because, our talk might have gotten too personal. What the hell was that? She stood up, saying she was running late. She has to get ready, and it was probably a bad idea to discuss it with me. I asked, are you still going for it? We're leaving this chat in the middle. She looked back and responded in a way that marked my remarks. Yes, I am going on the date. Leaving the conversation in the middle, he does this frequently to annoy me. Except it wasn't hilarious this time. I sat in disbelief. 5 minutes later, she emerges from the room and says, it's just dinner. Do not make a big issue about it. Pretend this conversation never occurred. I called up from the couch, unsure what to do or how to respond. She stepped out of the room, looking stunning in her red dress, and remarked, oh, look at your face. Red like my outfit. Hold tight to your desires, and we'll have fun tonight. She tried to be sweet with lots of I love yous. I took a deep breath and tried to remind myself that it wasn't a big deal and that she was only going to have dinner. It was no big deal, right? But I felt uneasiness and discomfort in my chest. I could not remain calm, no matter how hard I tried. I called a friend for a beer, and we went out drinking. I really wanted to split my anxiety with him, but I thought it was a little early, so I discussed the situation with him in third person. I informed him that my colleague was in trouble. I'm not sure if I communicated correctly or if he understood my situation. He claimed it was nothing to be concerned about, as if it were just a casual dinner in a public place. I was still sitting at the bar when I received a call from Berlin, asking me to come home. I was surprised because it was still 9 o'clock, and she was at home. She was only gone for a couple of hours. I feel ashamed to admit it, but I felt relieved and happy that she was back home, and I assumed nothing had happened between them. That's correct. Simp man. Blah, blah. Read the entire thing. So I went home and she ran to hug me. At this point, I was on a different tangent. I was thinking she might have made up a story, just a mess in my head. Alternatively, you could simply put me to the test. You understand how women are. I inquired, "What's up?" She sat me down and said it was a lot of fun and exciting. She feels so alive after this date that they are planning a weekend away. What's the F? I freaked out. I snapped at her and got up. She held my hands and asked me to relax. She said it was just for fun to regain my energy. Don't you want your old Merlin? Who is always full of new energy. See, I'm already halfway through my date with him. After only 2 hours. You know I love you, and this is just going to add up to our happiness. I said, let me get this straight. So you want to F this man over the weekend, and you think it would strengthen our relationship? She was like, yeah, pretty much. I was cornered and asked, he slept already, didn't you? I was an inch closer to being violent. Only God knows how I controlled it. Told myself. She pushed me away and swore that nothing had happened yet. But she really wanted to go for the weekend trip. She said, I love you, and this won't mean anything, but I really want to explore this fantasy of mine. Just by talking about this, I'm getting wet down there. Do you want to feel it? I yelled out, why did you quench it today if you're so desperately wanted to be with someone else? She screamed back, saying they saved the excitement for the trip. She was headstrong that she wanted to go for it and see how it actually felt. I was pretty much drunk, and before I made a foolish mistake, I drove off. I called my friend to ask if I could sleep on his couch. I came back home in the morning to get ready for work, and she was sleeping blissfully. When I was getting ready, she came and hugged me from behind, saying, I love you. I shrugged her off. She said, I know you are mad at me now, but I'm also sure that you love me enough to let me do what makes me happy. I didn't say a word and left for work. I'm feeling miserable. I cannot focus on anything today. Thursday and Saturday, she wants to go screwing with that dude. I can't stop feeling miserable about it. I know my marriage is certainly over now. I'm not even thinking about saving it anymore. All I want is to make that bitch pay for opening her legs for another man. Well, darn well that more has happened, and it was never about just going for dinner. It's time to hit and run and leave no prisoners here. Here's a reality check. If your wife comes to you and wants to go on a date with someone else, it's always a big deal. Time to buck up. The moment she suggested anything like that in the first place, you should have known better. Update 1. I made her freeze in the cold, frigid night. Yes, her body was too overheated up with the motions down below, and it needed some cold therapy. After I was done talking about the situation on Thursday, I sat down to draft my strategy. Like I mentioned, I can now let her walk all over me. While on my way back home, I bought the house lock and booked a locksmith to come down on Saturday to change it. I purchased another nameplate for the house with just my name. When I went back home, she was wearing see-through lingerie. I was surprised, like, what's this all about? She looked at me and asked, isn't this sultry to make anyone beg for me? I want to look my best on Saturday. She giggled and continued, I skipped work and went shopping. Not that I wanted to save my relationship, but I wanted to capture her remarks so that she doesn't back out later. My phone was in my pocket with the recorder on. I asked her if she still wanted to do this, despite knowing there will be a consequence. She touched my lips and murmured, what are the consequences? There'd be no consequences. I adore you, and I know you love me. This is only for fun, like you're going fishing to clean your mind. Take it in the same manner. I asked her, so you're saying you're certain about having sex with your colleague, despite the fact that I do not approve of this extramarital sex? She said, yes, indeed. So why are you making such a huge deal out of it? It's only sex. I am not marrying him or anything. I do not love him. I love you. She kissed my cheeks and whispered, I love you, but I really want to do this. It's only one life. I want to try everything. I was appalled by her touch, but I allowed her to do so because I was recording her. Closer is better. I freshened myself and headed out with a friend. This time I told him everything. Last time I wanted to protect more of his reputation in front of my friend, but now I don't care. She wants to show off her tits to the world, so be it. My acquaintance mentioned that I was sleeping on his couch, which pretty much sums it up for him. But he was surprised to learn what Merlin was up to. I didn't say anything about my plans. I intended to keep it a secret until I executed it, but I told him I was ending our marriage. He claimed to know a lawyer who helped his uncle save a large sum of alimony going to see his narcissistic wife. I demanded that he obtain the lawyer's information. Funny, he already had it for me. That is how friendship works, you know. I went home that night. She was in bed. I took out my pillow and blanket. She inquired where I was heading. I asked, "Why do you care?" She glanced at me and whispered, "Do you remember our vows that we would never sleep separately?" I flung the pillows back onto the bed and yelled, "So let's see who is talking about the vows. We also promised never to bet anyone else. Remember?" She exhaled that I acted unreasonable, tossed and slapped the opposite side. I gathered my belongings and went to the couch. I surely cannot share a bed with someone who sleeps with me yet fantasizes about other men. She spent the entire Friday evening getting ready and packing her bag for her big day. Meanwhile, I met with my divorce lawyer on Friday afternoon to discuss my terms. He heard the recordings and urged me to obtain evidence of their stay if feasible. Nevertheless, the recording is sufficient. When she went to take a shower on Saturday morning, I snooped into her packed bag, swapped her lubricant tube with a comparable tube for the hot white sauce of the same texture, and returned it. I knew she couldn't have sex without breasts. She's one of them who is concerned about unpleasant entering. I wish I could see how she applied the pun to her lady bits. The fun part is that they're going to a resort in the middle of a forest. It's unfortunate that she can't buy another tube herself. I sneaked into her phone and then her texts to find out where they were staying. I couldn't find it, but I did find hundreds of texts exchanged between them in the last 3 days, discussing how they planned to accomplish it. The conversations revealed that they hadn't done it previously. It does not matter. My marriage is ended. I didn't have time to take screenshots, so I took images of their discussions with my phone before anyone wonders how I get access to her phone. Let me tell you something. We both know each other's phone passwords. I hadn't spied on her phone previously because I didn't feel the urge to. After she got out of the shower, I asked where she was. She flushed and asked, "Now you care?" I replied, "If your lover chokes you to death with his big tool, I should know where to pick up your dead body." She chuckled as she told me the name of the resort. I messaged it to my lawyer, who told me that he would obtain a copy of their stay. Apparently, hotels share this information with lawyers. I'm not sure how to ask. After a time, I noticed a car honking in her driveway. She was still not prepared. She was about to go to the window and possibly call them inside. I shouted, "Don't you dare call him inside my home. You'd both lie here with broken limbs." She chuckled and ordered him from the window to stay in his car, and she will come. I turned up the volume on the television to its utmost. She was saying something, but I didn't hear. After she left, I called the locksmith and had the locks changed. I took her name from the nameplate at the entrance. Then I packed all of her belongings in large rubbish bags and stored them in the backyard. The empty closet brought me back to reality. I sat down and howled like a baby for several hours. It was already evening by then. I had 2 choices. Pity myself and suffer for the mistakes I never committed, or take control of my life and go forward. I selected the latter. I showered and headed out with a friend. He has been helping me stay sane. Today is Sunday. I went to the gym early in the morning to get rid of bad ideas before sitting down to write this post. She is expected to return tonight. I can't wait to tell you all about her reaction to the closed house. Thank you for reading this. It's about how she's basically rubbing everything in your face. She transformed you into a fool. Merlin finally got to have the fun she had been looking forward to on Sunday. She arrived before schedule. It appears she left the resort in the afternoon without taking a shower. I noticed her enter the driveway. She appeared angry and unhappy, as if she had been glowing with vitality when she left and was now upset upon her return. She appeared unhappy with smudged makeup. Her screw partner abandoned her, but she did not say goodbye to him. Too awful for her. She tried to open the door but found it locked. She took out her key and attempted to unlock it. That's where things got interesting. I was monitoring her through the camera mounted above her entrance. She was sleepy and reaching for other keys to unlock it. She dropped her bag and money to the floor, cursing out. Then she began knocking on the door, pressing the doorbell and yelling, "Are you home? Why doesn't this stupid door open?" I texted her, "Check out the name plate in the backyard." I then blocked her. It was a sufficient clue for her. She realized that the lock had been changed, and she was no longer welcome in the house. She began yelling my name, begging me to come out, and knocking on the door. I yelled from the window that if she didn't leave, I would record her, her parents, and her friends. She was astounded that I had recorded her. She began crying, "Why are you doing this to me? I'm freezing in this cold. It's too cold outside. My body is already numb from the 4-hour drive. Please open the door." I did not open it and let her plead. She proceeded, "I'm already feeling unhappy and guilty about my decision. That idiot forced himself on me, despite the fact that I told him I don't do it without lube." I was frozen to death when I heard this. I opened the door to let her in. She attempted to hug me, but I blocked her. She sat on the couch and broke down. I stayed silent for a minute. Then I questioned her, why she hadn't called for help. My throat dried up as I asked her, "Did he rape you?" She stopped and said, "Not rape, but he persuaded me into doing it and said it wouldn't hurt. But it did hurt and I told him to stop, but he did not." I inquired whether it happened only once. She said, "No, 3 to 4 times, and each time he persuaded you to try again and you did?" She said, "Yes." I lost my composure and snapped at her, "You manipulative witch, do you think I am a jerk for believing you? Are you 16 years old who was manipulated? You had a resort, not his house, from which you could not flee. You may have pushed him and walked away, but you didn't. You stayed the night with him, you tried God knows how many times, in the hopes of getting the excitement you were looking for." She started crying and stated, "The resort was in the midst of a jungle. How could I avoid him? Yes, it was, but it was not deserted. There were resort workers and other visitors who might have helped you. Also, why don't you phone me if you feel threatened?" She kept crying because she didn't have a response. I told her to go, and that she'd be served within a week. She pleaded, "Please do not do this to me. I am already guilty of my decision, and I am suffering the consequences. You've already gotten your retribution by modifying the cycle. What else do you want?" I pledged to be a good wife and never nag about anything. I remained unimpressed and stated that the ship had already sailed. "Our marriage ended on Wednesday when you went on a date without my permission." She explained, "I promise you that nothing significant transpired between us. He barely got in. I rarely let him in, I can't do without lubrication." I laughed and replied, "Good for you, but we're finished here. I warned you there would be consequences. Remember?" She resumed her waterworks. "I thought our marriage was strong enough to last. I adore you, and I know you love me. Please do not do this." I said, "I loved you very much, but now I loathe you severely. Now, please leave if you don't want me to forward all of the recordings to your parents." She was once again taken aback by the fact that I was recording even in these chats. I said, "I'm no fool to talk to her off the record." She stated that she intended to file assault charges against Randy, and that she required my assistance in this matter. I laughed and said, "Too bad. You have to deal with it all alone. Not just the court case, but also our divorce." She begged me not to leave me in this stressful situation. I opened the door for her and explained that I never wanted to deal with anything alone. "But you wanted a thrill, correct? What better way to deal with 2 court situations simultaneously?" Following a lot of friction, she finally departed. I submitted the divorce papers to her office because I didn't know where she was residing. However, my lawyer received a call from the courier business informing him that the receiver had resigned from that office. Therefore, I had to forward the papers to her parents. I decided to stop by and inform them in person about the situation before the documents arrived. They've been sending me lovely emails, so I suppose I owed them this much. They wondered why I had come alone and where was Merlin. I told them we were divorcing, and I had no idea where she was. They were terrified of my response. I offered them the surface-level explanation that she went out with her colleague against my objections, and now I can't get her back. Her mother immediately called and asked her to come home. She responded that she was out of town, seeing her best friend Kathy, and would return following the weekend. Alternatively, they normally pay her a visit anytime she is home. Crap, their childhood pals. Kathy's ex-mother-in-law called and confirmed that Merlin was with her, despite the fact that she was in a bad mood, and she told her that she would look after her. Honestly, I was relieved to know she was safe when my wrath dissipated and I learned that she had recently resigned her job. I became anxious and concerned about her well-being. Merlin has paid a high price for her entitlement, but that does not mean I will take her back. Never, that is it. I can't go into depth about my divorce terms because it's still ongoing. I'm not sure I'll even update it because I just want to get past this. I've been engaging with this community for the past month. Updating, responding to comments, and communicating via DMs. It was very helpful to me, but I'm afraid I won't be able to go on because I'm continuously debating this topic. So, I'll leave it here. Maybe after everything is finished or when my feelings change, I'll update on the remaining details. Thank you for commenting on my post. I mean, anything consensual is never okay, but drugs obviously took some hard lefts together where she is today, and she's deluded to think you'd ever be all right with something like that, especially given you hadn't even discussed it before, and you're certainly correct. Okay, she desired excitement in her life. What could be more thrilling than courtship? I'm very sure you don't treat your loved ones the way she treated you, but it is just me here. Here is the next story. It's lengthy and ongoing, involving a custody struggle for my friend's daughter. The matter is still in court. To avoid incriminating myself, I will minimize the information to be anonymous. I will use fictitious names and omit certain details. This is the story of my former best friend and business partner and his wife. He's still my friend, but we aren't as close as we once were. This issue influenced both of our lives, thus I believe I am in a good position to share it. Some of you may regard me as the evil guy, but please consider yourself in my situation before passing judgment. Perhaps you will understand, perhaps you will not, but I don't care. My friend's name is Joe. We grew up together in the Midwest. He is a great guy. It would not damage anyone. An introvert, geeky, and extremely intelligent. We have opposite personalities but get along well. We are the same age and enjoy playing video games together. I participated in rock during high school and joined the military after graduation. Joe wanted to join, but his father refused because it was during the Middle East War. His father opposed the Middle Eastern wars. I'm not saying his father was wrong. Many of my friends died needlessly over there. Joe could have been one of them, but it didn't go well for him and he's now serving more than 20 years in prison. It appears that his fate was to either end up in the Middle East or serve time here because of a woman. I couldn't help but wonder what I could have done differently. Perhaps I could have prevented his relationship with his future wife from becoming too intense when he first told me he was seeing someone. It was near the end of my military service. I also wondered if I was as guilty as him because I was too afraid to tell him the truth. I still have secrets that I haven't told Joe, and I know he would be devastated if he found out. I was honorably discharged from the military after serving for 8 years, the majority of which was spent in the Middle East. A few days after I returned, I invited Joe to join me for a drink at the bar. Joe is now very busy and had previously declined my invitation once. It's becoming increasingly difficult to convince him to take time off work. We met up occasionally when I was on leave, but we've drifted apart since. Joe currently operates his own manufacturing company. He earned a degree in bioengineering and manages a 7-figure firm without joining the military. He began less than 4 years after I left the service. On the other hand, I served in the military for 8 years, and I'm now unemployed, unqualified for a high-paying career. I feel like I am starting at zero. I was not shocked by Joe's accomplishment. He's always been the smart one with all the answers. The objective of our meeting was to encourage him to hire me in his quickly developing business. We talked about it a lot when he launched the business while I was still in the service. I may help with customer interactions and obtaining parts overseas. He was making several visits to Asia to identify vendors for components. His team designed, and I believed I might help with that and other areas. We had discussed joining him when I completed my military service, so I arrived at the bar early that day, expecting he'd show up after previously canceling on me. When I pulled into the parking lot, his car was directly behind mine. His business was already thriving, and he was driving his dream sports vehicle. To maintain anonymity, I will not mention the car. I was thrilled to see him. I hadn't seen him in 2 years, and he'd gained around 40 pounds since then. We exchanged pleasantries as we entered the bar. Joe isn't the drinking or bar hopping type, but I've developed a habit of meeting people at bars over the years. During our talk, I attempted to bring up the job we had discussed years before, but he kept evading. He was more interested in discussing his Chinese wife, whom he had met in China and brought to the United States on a spousal visa. We chatted about her over the phone approximately a year ago when he brought her to the United States. He said he met her 2 years ago when traveling in China to find sources for a part he invented for his latest invention. She served as both his translator and liaison. He hired her promptly, and she spent roughly a year working from China before migrating to the United States. She is currently in charge of part sourcing, as well as worldwide and local supply chain distribution for his organization. They now own the business 50/50. After bringing her to the United States on a spousal visa, they conducted a court wedding in China. But she now wants a white wedding in the United States, something she has wanted since she was a child. Joe is a bit geeky and socially inept, so he easily falls for any girl who pays him attention. I always warn him since it never ends well. So I attempted to warn him about this too. She had taken far too much control over his firm in a short period of time. He even informed me they hadn't had sex yet because she wanted a white wedding first, adding that it should be special and take place after their wedding night. That struck me as ludicrous and a massive red flag. Despite knowing her for 2 years, bringing her to the United States, giving her control over critical aspects of his business, living with her for about a year and being married, they hadn't had sex. I'm not an expert on Chinese culture, but I know it's unusual for a woman to remain celibate after a man has done so much for her. When I inquired why they hadn't had the white wedding yet, he said that her parents were having visa complications, but were on their way to resolving them because she wanted them there. I called BS. She told him that if it were me, she would have given up by now. That bothered him and he became defensive. I told him I didn't know what made her so wonderful. He described her as an excellent business partner, intelligent, gorgeous, and hardworking. I urged him not to give her authority over his business and pointed out that many Asian girls are gorgeous and intelligent, so she is not unique. I also mentioned how uncommon it is that they haven't had sex yet after being married for so long. Joe was becoming agitated by my queries and how I was blowing his bubble by doubting his wife's intentions. So I decided to focus on the reason I was there. When I mentioned the job, he promised me again. I felt like I'd already annoyed him with my previous queries. His mood had shifted, and he no longer wanted to discuss the employment prospect. This didn't seem like the Joe I knew, possibly because he had money now. He believed that I should not have an opinion. At the end of the meeting, he tentatively agreed to notify me once he had rearranged things to guarantee he had a seat for me. After that, I felt as if my old friend had vanished, replaced by a businessman, a nerd in love with a girl he hardly knew and being led around. I decided that if he offered me a job, I would simply tell him what he wanted to hear and become a yes guy. I needed to watch out for myself. About 3 days later, he called and invited me to his house that evening. I prepared as if for an interview. I was nervous meeting someone who used to be my best friend because I wanted the job. I didn't want to say anything that may upset him. I knew how people grew apart. Someone who was your best buddy a few years ago may change as a result of their experiences and surroundings. I was unsure whether I would meet his wife because they lived together. I got to his residence at 9 or 10 p.m. He owned a great house in a desirable neighborhood. Nothing really extravagant at this point. I was still living with my parents and driving a useless car, so this was a huge issue for me. When I walked in, his wife was home. She seemed very shy and formal in her greetings. I wondered whether that was one of the reasons he liked her. In addition, she was stunning and had prepared some Chinese cuisine for dinner. After dinner, the 3 of us went to the living room to discuss business over wine. Long story short, I was offered the position of Vice President of Customer Relations and Sourcing with 2 employees reporting to me. Essentially, I would be the 3rd most important person after Kim, Joe's wife. I also learned more about the company, which employed 10 people at the time. Their primary business is to manufacture medical equipment and components, as well as parts for other industries. They engineer and assemble parts using only Asian components. They visit customers, assess their requirements, design the part, manufacture it in Asia, and assemble it in the United States. If you have good inventors and engineers, this model can be extremely profitable because the customer may require that part for the rest of their lives, making you their sole supplier since you own the patent. You can set the price without competition. I also realized Kim was more involved in the business than I had anticipated. She is in charge of supply chain, customer relations, marketing, and some hiring, while Joe, as president, is responsible for engineering, quality, and patents. So, I'd initially be more supportive of Kim than Joe. Kim speaks good English with a Chinese accent, is beautiful, and appears to be very competent and well-connected with suppliers and customers. She is only 25 and 2 years younger than us. Joe informed me that he was expediting my hiring because he and Kim were arranging a business trip to China and Vietnam in a few months. He asked me to replace him on the trip so that Kim could introduce me to their suppliers. He thought it would be a good moment to bring me in as the business grew. Kim makes this travel at least every 2 months, so it would be beneficial if I could assist and learn about that aspect of the firm. During the meeting, we drank some wine, and they both became more calm. Looking back, I could tell Kim was being a little stiff in front of Joe, but her more gregarious nature would occasionally shine through. I didn't think much of it, and even if I had, I wouldn't mention it, knowing how much Joe dislikes hearing criticism about his wife. About a week later, I began my job training. I had my own office and was being shown the ropes. 2 weeks later, there was a manufacturing expo in Vegas that attracted many medical industry clients, providing an excellent opportunity to showcase our products and firm. So Joe, Kim, another male coworker, and I attended the 3-day exposition. We had booked a tiny booth for the occasion. I was lucky to be invited on the trip, as it presented me with a chance to learn more about the business by presenting our products to customers and guests. The expo ran from Wednesday to Friday, so we planned to fly in on Tuesday and be flexible about our return date, dependent on the results of our meetings and any additional chances. We flew into Vegas on a Tuesday night, and all 4 of us stayed at the same hotel. I assumed I wouldn't have time to tour Vegas because of all the marketing and product material I needed to evaluate. I had some inquiries, so I decided to stop by Joe and Kim's suite when I arrived at their hotel. Joe explained that Kim had gone downstairs to take a break, if I recall well. Joe was reviewing some designs, but he was unable to answer all of my questions clearly because they were more relevant to Kim's side of the business. After meeting with Joe, I left his room and contemplated going downstairs to check on Kim. Joe isn't the type of guy who hangs out at the pub solely to drink. He is not a drinker. There must be some reason, like doing business or meeting up with pals. I walked downstairs to see if Kim was at the casino and found her conversing with a guy at the bar. She instantly waved me over when I joined them. They began to ask my opinion on a particular horse racing tournament on which people were wagering. I knew nothing about horse racing, but I felt like they were trying to throw me off since she was captured. I didn't see anything improper with her talking to someone at the bar. She might be looking for business, which is why we were in Vegas, right? But the way she replied suggested that she was trying to hide something. She was drinking, and it appeared that they were flirting before being discovered. She tried to play it off as if they wanted my opinion on horse racing, but the guy walked away soon after with a frustrated expression. I began chatting with Kim about the questions I needed answers to. She'd already had a few drinks and was more open than normal, being a gregarious person. I was able to strike up a discussion, and we began discussing her relationship with Joe. Surprisingly, she didn't have anything positive to say about him. She stated that he was all about work, highly judgmental, and had preconceived notions about how people should behave. I did not contribute anything to her remarks concerning Joe. I simply followed along with the chat, agreeing with whatever she said. I'd learned not to get between them before that. That's when I discovered more about her. She was born in China and was the only child. Her parents were strict, and she grew up in a traditional Chinese environment. However, She had a wealthy uncle who sent her to a good school and sent her to the United States on vacation multiple times. She graduated early from college and worked as a liaison between Chinese and international enterprises, where she met Joe. We spoke for at least an hour, getting to know each other. The pub was sparsely populated because most people were at the casino, and everyone was keeping to themselves. We got along really well that night and felt some chemistry developing, probably owing to the booze. I tried to lighten the tension by proposing we contact Joe to join us, but she said he was already asleep and that staying up late at the pub wasn't his style. I knew she was correct. It was not his type of scene. I regretted asking that question since I sensed the tension was high. I excused myself to visit the restroom because I was having sexual thoughts and sensed a lot of sexual tension in the air, which I knew was unacceptable. She wasn't coming on to me, but we were both flirting on a subtle level. I could argue that I was the one who took the initiative, and she was only playing along. Perhaps I could blame the drink. Perhaps I could blame the drink. I decided to excuse myself to relieve some stress because I felt like I was ready to betray my best friend and boss by becoming connected with his wife, whom he adored. I did not want to lose my job over this, and furthermore, I was not that type of guy, or so I thought. I went to the bathroom to straighten my pants, and when I came out, I noticed another guy hitting on her as she was sitting on the bar stool. He left as soon as I returned. When I sat down next to her, I knew why she was receiving so much attention. She looked amazing, a 9 or 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. She spotted me staring at her, and all I could say was that the music was fantastic and asked if she wanted to dance, which was intended as a joke because the music was bad. She giggled and claimed it was a slow dance track she didn't enjoy. I meant it as a joke, but she seemed open to it despite the terrible music. I asked her what sort of music she loved, and she said R&B, EDM, and house music. I felt like I had gone too far. I offered if she wanted to visit any clubs in Vegas that played that type of music. To my astonishment, she knew exactly which ones she preferred, as if she had been there before. I questioned how she knew about them, and she claimed she came with a buddy for her birthday and had been to a few Vegas clubs. She has also traveled to Vegas on business several times. Felt like she was bragging at that point. I assumed this was not the Kim I knew. Joe had given her wide license, especially when she denied being connected to him, stating they required a white wedding before they could be intimate. I was convinced she was hiding her true self from Joe and was not the virtuous woman she claimed to be. That night, I witnessed a smart, shrewd, manipulative, and gorgeous woman who enjoyed flirting and attracting attention from men, particularly those who were not her husband. I thought Joe was in trouble because she seemed overly ambitious and dissatisfied with her situation. She just criticized Joe and said she could do better. It appeared that she was attempting to build out her own empire using Joe as a vehicle to get there. I followed her example and went to a Las Vegas club that played EDM and house music. There was a huge line, so we waited and flirted with each other. We were tipsy and immersed in our own little universe. Once inside, we had our hands all over each other on the dance floor. We were grinding so closely together that it felt like we were doing it while dressed. I got carried away at one point and ended up with 2 of my fingers inside her while we danced. She stopped me and recommended we go back before Joe went looking for her. I checked the time, and it was already around 1 a.m. She was correct. I had to get up early to open the booth, and I needed some sleep because the next day would be long. We exited the club and waited in line for a taxi. I bribed the guy in charge of the line with $20 to get us ahead on the short journey to the motel. Kim and I were making out in the taxi's rear seat. Before I knew it, she had unzipped me and began giving me a BJ, unconcerned that the driver could see us in the rearview mirror. We were a few blocks away from the hotel when the driver playfully ordered us to stop and get a room. She came to a stop after that, and the cab took us to the hotel. We were on the same floor in the elevator, and when we got out, I assumed we'd proceed to my room to finish what she had started. Instead, she simply murmured "good night" and went to the room she shared with her husband. I stayed up late that night wondering what could have happened. The next morning, a knock on my door jolted me awake. The other employee came with us and reminded me that we needed to pack and set up our exhibit early. Attendees arrived before the expo started. The aim was to arrive before 7 a.m., but it was already a few minutes past 7. I immediately got ready, brushed my teeth, and headed downstairs. I wasn't thinking about the previous night until I now noticed Joe and Kim eating breakfast downstairs. I wasn't sure how Kim would react when she saw me, but she welcomed me as if nothing had occurred. We didn't have time to join them, so we went to the location to unpack and prepare everything. When we arrived at the venue, we unpacked and set everything up. A few people and potential clients stopped by our booth, and I was busy pitching our products before Kim and Joe arrived. I tried to look at Kim sometimes while we attended to individuals, but she refused to look at or talk to me. It was awkward. It appeared that she was avoiding eye contact, feeling that what occurred was an error. I wondered if the booze had influenced her conduct. She was tipsy, made a mistake, and I took advantage of it. Before the expo concluded that day, I had a feeling she would confess to Joe, and I would be in trouble. She was clearly avoiding me, and I was terrified she'd tell Joe what occurred last night. I worried about losing both my career and a friend. To make matters worse, she left before the expo ended, and Joe informed me she was not feeling well. I believe part of the reason she left was that I made her uncomfortable. I felt bad when I shared a cab with Joe after the exhibition. I hated being in that circumstance and accepted full responsibility. On the walk back to the hotel, I considered telling Joe what occurred to control the narrative, but it would be difficult to explain how his wife ended up with me, so I remained silent for the rest of the day. I couldn't think of anything else except her, not only sexually but also because I was afraid she would tell Joe about it, costing me my job, reputation, and disgrace. Oh, I'd be screwed big time. I felt the need to communicate with her. I felt like my job was on the line, and I couldn't wait until the next day to meet with her. That day, I walked downstairs to the bar, thinking she was still there from the night before, but she wasn't. It was a long evening. The next day at the expo, while we were in the booth, Joe was dealing with a customer, and the other employee was absent. There were only Kim and I at the booth, and there were no other guests. There was an opportunity to speak with Kim alone, but I had no idea what to say. I called her and attempted to say something as she stared at me, expecting me to talk, but I kept stuttering. She had this look on her face that said, "What the hell is wrong with you, dude?" I ended up apologizing for the other day, and she said, "I know it will never happen again." She simply looked away from me and continued about her business as if nothing had happened. It was almost as if the entire night was a blur to her. The tension was broken when a visitor approached our booth and inquired about our product. After that day, I felt a little better. When we were alone, her reaction was so apathetic that you would expect someone who did what she did to have more to say. I returned to the motel that night feeling slightly better than the previous day and slept well. The following morning, the last day, was scheduled to spend a half day at the booth with meetings with possible customers interested in our services. The other employee and I spent most of the day arranging for our merchandise to be shipped back home. Joe and Kim stopped by a few times, but they spent the majority of their day in private meetings with clients and consumers. I had some normal interactions with Kim that day. No awkwardness. It was as if the fling from 2 days ago never occurred. After the event, the four of us took an Uber back to the airport. I was seated in the front seat. Joe, Kim, and another coworker were sitting in the back. I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed Joe and Kim speaking and laughing with each other and another employee. I felt as if I had escaped a bullet and was relieved that things with Kim did not go further. The trip to China was postponed, although I'm not sure why. However, I am aware that Joe and Kim had intended to have the white wedding she had always desired. Her Chinese parents had already arrived in the United States, and the majority of Joe's colleagues had also attended the ceremony. At this point, I didn't see Joe very much, and our relationship had transitioned to a more traditional boss-employee dynamic. I was generating more money than I could anywhere else, and I expected my income to increase in less than a year based on the company's performance during this time. We also employed 6 more salaried personnel. There were now 3 managers, me and 2 other guys, Kim and Joe, 3 engineers, and 21 hourly people. The next month, Kim and I planned a trip to China so she could introduce me to other vendors and select a source for components for our next product launch. When I was ready for the vacation, I was certain that something sexual would occur. Our business class seats were adjacent to each other, and we were staying in the same hotel. We planned to visit 2 places together for business, and she would then travel to her relatives in Western China before returning to the United States. Things were going great for me at the time. I had enough money for a down payment on a property and a committed girlfriend, friend despite my desire to Kim. I hoped it didn't grow into an intimate encounter because if she made a move on me, I wasn't sure I could say no. During our long flight, we largely discussed business and had polite conversations, but nothing sexual. One exchange that struck out was when she asked me a hypothetical question about whether I thought she was a strong leader and whether I would join her if she founded her own firm. I responded, yes, of course. But in the back of my mind, I thought that was an odd question. Why would she want to create her own firm when she was already a key partner in her husband's thriving business? They were just married. Therefore, they weren't suffering marital troubles. That question did not make sense until several years later. The rest of the week was spent networking, developing business ties, and sourcing providers for future product development. We remained in the same hotel for 2 days in one city and 1 day in another before she traveled to the western part of the country to see her family. I didn't go out to explore or sightsee because those were not my interests. I spent the majority of my time on the phone with customers in the United States or working on my laptop, ensuring that everything back home ran smoothly. After my one visit to China, I felt confident and at ease in my role. I imagined myself as an international businessman and even a product marketer, which I did not attend school for and was not qualified for. I owed everything to Joe for giving me the opportunity. After our trip to China, it became clear that the affair had been brief. I was relieved that it never happened again, and our relationship became more professional from that point forward. A few months later, I got engaged to my girlfriend, and we married soon after. Financially, things were going so well that I was earning nearly $120,000 after approximately a year of employment there. Kim became pregnant during the same time period and gave birth to a baby girl months later. My wife gave birth around the same time as we were all the same age, married around the same time, and had daughters the same age. Joe and Kim attempted to include us in every event they hosted. They were trying to get us to become close friends, and my wife was on board, but I did my best to keep things strictly business. I was more concerned with work and family and did not want to get involved in anything that would interfere with my marriage or work. I had a strange feeling about Kim and Joe's marriage, especially how she appeared to control him, and I didn't want to get involved. Furthermore, I did not want my affair with her to be exposed or put me in a position where it could continue. Fast forward 2 years, and business was thriving. I was making around $250,000 per year, and we were expecting our second child. Joe called me one evening and suggested we go to a bar. I thought it was strange because we hadn't hung out in a long time, and Joe wasn't the type to hang out at a bar unless it was for business or something meaningful. The man rarely drinks, so I was understandably nervous about the situation. The thought in the back of my mind was that perhaps my sins from 2 years ago with his wife had come back to haunt me. I went to the bar expecting to be fired or have something bad happen, even though I knew him well enough to know that if he found out about the affair, he would most likely fire me over the phone, eliminating the need for a meeting at the bar. I wondered if he wanted to handle things differently. Perhaps I was overthinking it. I went to the bar nervous as hell, but when I got there and he started telling me his problems, it wasn't about me. Instead, it was about his and Kim's relationship being on the rocks. He had been having family problems and wanted to voice his frustrations to me. Like I mentioned earlier, I didn't hang out with him that much anymore. He said the reason he doesn't hang out with me and some of his friends that often is because Kim tried to isolate him from anyone close to him. He said that over the years, he and Kim had drifted apart due to frequent traveling. To make matters worse, her parents, who had visited them 2 years ago when they got married, refused to leave and were now trying to control how their 2-year-old daughter was being raised, causing friction in their marriage. He was having problems raising his daughter in a multicultural home, especially since her parents were still there. He complained that his in-laws do not listen to him and tried to isolate him in his own home. I paid close attention to what he was saying. It seemed like he had been going through this for a while and didn't have anybody to share his story with. I was probably the closest friend he had, and I didn't feel close to him anymore. It must have been really tough for him to share because he knew I had warned him about this years ago. I felt really angry for him. I thought it was wrong for them to try to take advantage of him because of his meek personality. I wanted to tell him to just kick the in-laws out, but he said that his wife had agreed that the in-laws would be leaving for China in a few weeks. Just by listening to him, I could tell that Kim was totally in control of the home. He walked on eggshells around his own house, which probably gave his in-laws the confidence to dictate how he should raise his own daughter. I didn't want to come on too strong and tell him to lay down the law like the man of the house because that would be inappropriate, and he is not that kind of person. So, I asked him what Kim thought about her family staying in their home so long and trying to raise their daughter the way they wanted. He said that Kim supported it and even encouraged it because she said their upbringing made her the woman she is today. He told me that Kim also said that since they both travel often, her parents are the only stable force in their child's life. After he said that, I didn't find many flaws in Kim's logic based on how Joe explained it. Kim and Joe do travel a lot, sometimes for weeks, and it would be good to have someone permanent around. But I didn't tell Joe that I knew there was more to the story, so I pressed on. He later told me that they hadn't been intimate for over 4 months when they are not on business trips. She uses every excuse to avoid intimacy with him, from too much burden at work to their daughter needing attention, anything to rebuff his advances. He tried to convince her to be a stay-at-home mom, but even I know that Kim is too ambitious for that. He complained that she refuses to have more kids, and all he wanted was a simple wife who would be home and raise the family. He said they have all the money they need, but she continues to want more control over his business. I asked him if he had even considered divorce. That way he would have shared custody of his daughter and could spend more time with her without outside interference and protect his finances because most often whoever files for divorce first will likely get the upper hand. He said that he hadn't considered filing for divorce or speaking with a lawyer. He wanted to talk to her about marriage counseling. I didn't try to dissuade him from going to marriage counseling, but I told him that he should always have a plan B. I also warned him to be vigilant about her movements. I told him to find a way to monitor her phone, track her movements to make sure she is going where she says she is, and install a GPS in her car if possible. He responded by looking at me like I was speaking another language. He gave me a "how the hell could I suggest such a thing" look. He angrily dismissed my suggestion by saying that most of her trips are international and that she is not the kind of person who would have an affair. At that moment, I knew he was in trouble. I felt like I should just keep quiet before I incriminate myself, so I just sat there quietly, listening to his stories without offering any tangible opinion, only telling him what he wanted to hear. My assessment at that point was that Kim was either having an affair or planning to divorce him. This poor guy was the stupidest smart person I had ever known, too oblivious to realize when the rug was about to be pulled out from under him. I was glad we had that meeting because it allowed me to prepare for the eventuality. I didn't know what impact their pending divorce would have, but I knew I needed to plan for an exit. I realized I wouldn't be able to make the same amount of money somewhere else. The only way to maintain my income was to replicate his business model and start my own thing, using the knowledge and experience I already had. I already suspected that Kim was trying to take over the business because of things she had said to me in the past and the fact that she had taken over the hiring process, bringing in people loyal to her, mostly Chinese employees. I suspected something was up but couldn't make sense of it. She even controlled the employees that worked under me because she had hired them, and I couldn't make any moves without them reporting to her. I didn't trust the employees under me. She had made the workplace toxic. I tried to take control of my team, but she fought back, and I had to stand down to avoid getting fired. After my conversation with Joe at the bar, I noticed he was slowly losing motivation and slacking on his responsibilities. The good news was that they had created such a good business model that it could sustain itself without prospecting for more customers, as the current customer base was enough to make it profitable. But there wouldn't be any new product advancement or growth. A few days later, I noticed that Kim wasn't showing up to work as often and wasn't answering her phone, even when I called her on WhatsApp. A day or two later, some of our suppliers overseas stopped responding promptly. I also noticed that we had lost some customers, and it was obvious something was happening. After 5 consecutive days of her absence, Joe called me and 3 other managers into his office to explain what was going on. He told us that he had a disagreement with his wife, and she was trying to destroy the business. Some of the suppliers and customers were loyal to her, and she had been trying to create our own business and ruin our reputation. He suggested that the fallout would be immense, and we should brace ourselves. We could have to let half our employees go. He told me that I would have to travel to China and Vietnam the following week to obtain other suppliers, while he would manage the customer interaction aspect of the business. After the two other managers left the room, Joe and I chatted alone, and he told me that I had been right all along. He explained that the damage on the business would have been far greater if he hadn't caught her sooner. She could put all our ideas in motion after our meeting at the pub. He couldn't stop thinking about the prospect of adultery, so he installed a monitoring device on her phone. It discovered she had been in intimate connections with numerous men on WeChat. One of them had previously proposed to her. She had accepted, and they planned to move in together and start a similar business to ours. She was going to marry him and move him to the States now that she was a citizen due to Joe. The man had an engineering degree like Joe, was much older, and had a greater network in China. Apparently, they had known each other much longer than she had known Joe. According to the text messages Joe found, she told him that she planned to divorce Joe and take over the company. I wasn't sure how she intended to accomplish it, but Joe told me she intended to divorce him in around 5 months. But she was exposed too early, prompting her to act hastily. Joe uncovered everything and confronted her, so she stopped showing up at work. Most of her vacations were not just business-related but also romantic retreats. Joe told me that before he discovered her affair, she vowed to attend to marriage counseling and urged him to begin individual treatment. All the while she had already decided to divorce him and was simply buying time. He told me that he was extremely depressed and had been contemplating suicide for some days. When he started crying, I hugged him to console him. He seemed to have been holding down his emotions for quite some time. I asked him where his daughter was and if the in-laws were still at his house. He said the in-laws had left. He had hired a babysitter for their children, and his wife had disappeared after he confronted her. He informed me he had called her several times, but she did not answer. He knew she had been calling his suppliers and customers, ordering them to stop doing business with him and exchanging all kinds of damaging papers in an attempt to destroy him. However, some of the clients were loyal enough or suspected it was a fraud, so they called him and informed him of the situation. Some providers were solely concerned with money and would stop communicating if they were not paid, so her idea did not pan out as she had intended. At this point, I assumed Kim had abandoned her husband and daughter to join her boyfriend, fiancé in China, where she was unsuccessfully attempting to steal some of his business by calling his customers and suppliers. She had already destroyed a number of his suppliers in China and Vietnam, so it was only a matter of time before we ran out of certain components, and our customers complained about late delivery. I had already visited China and Vietnam several times and had established a network of contacts in that part of the world, so I knew my way around. I'd also been looking for suppliers in South America, but with little success. Before we planned our one-way trip to China, we only had about a month's supply of some crucial items that she had effectively damaged, so we had priorities. We scheduled a one-way vacation because we didn't know when we'd return unless we found alternative suppliers who could give us the crucial components. I didn't spend much time wondering why Kim would want to destroy a firm she helped start because I knew she was always attempting to silence Joe and take over the company. But he was too blind to notice until it was too late. And now we're running around like chickens. Back then, I was perplexed by her conduct. I reasoned that taking over the business would make more sense than attempting to start one with someone else, even if he was more successful. I suspected she had accidentally fired the trigger, and that her entire strategy was poorly thought out and doomed to fail. I'm not sure if there was more to the story than I knew, but based on my perspective and the information I had, it was the conclusion I could draw from her reasoning at this point. All I cared about was saving this firm so I could keep paying my mortgage and living the luxurious lifestyle my lovely wife and children were accustomed to. I felt like she was the enemy and didn't think about the 37 employees who made a living from the business. Joe had developed. We spent around 2 weeks in East Asia, seeing 3 countries. By the end of our tour, we had recovered some of our prior goods since, bizarrely, Kim had stopped calling them and was not keeping her promises. At the end of the day, money buys loyalty, and we were willing to pay. I found it weird that she abruptly paused her efforts to damage the company. Whatever the reason, it was ideal for me. After we returned to the United States, It took approximately a month to weather the storm, but everything ultimately returned to normal. We never heard from Kim, and I never saw her again throughout those months. I realized that Joe was never the same. He had always been an introvert, but now he kept to himself even more, becoming increasingly suspicious and protective. When I asked him whether he had heard anything about Kim, he stated that she had abandoned him and their kid, and that he had not heard from her. He began asking why I was fascinated, which seemed strange given what we had gone through. A few weeks later, I received word from an employee that Kim had been reported missing. Her relatives stated they did not know where she was and had not heard from her in weeks. I quickly called Joe, who confirmed it as accurate. He informed me that the police had spoken to him and suspected foul play. There was no proof she had returned to China, and Joe was the last person to see her, making him the primary suspect. Joe told me that he hadn't told the police about his wife's infidelity for fear of it being used as a reason to arrest him, and he requested me not to notify them either. At this point, I had no reason to assume Joe was participating, nor did I want to, even if he was. I would cover for him because it was better for her to go missing than to jeopardize my income. 3 months after her supposed disappearance, I observed a significant shift in Joe. He was more outgoing, phoning me frequently, and attempting to hang out. Our firm was starting to revive, and I'd been to East Asia a few times. I persuaded Joe to come out more frequently and hang out with my family. I also brought him to bars and outings with my military friends to help him relax socially and meet new people. When we were out, I tried not to mention Kim. She was old news. While we were hanging out, Joe told me that Kim's parents and wealthy uncle had been phoning the police to have him arrested because they felt he had done something to Kim. However, there was no indication of a crime. Joe had gladly allowed the police access to his home, and they had already searched everything. He told them everything he knew except about the affair. From the outside, there were no symptoms of marital difficulty, and neither of them had attempted to contact a divorce counsel prior to her departure. They discovered that Kim had taken out a large life insurance policy on Joe without his knowledge, which made the situation even odder. The police were most likely perplexed as well. From their perspective, Joe had no reason to trigger his wife's abduction. The cops most likely discussed Kim in detail with the company's other 2 managers. I know this since they talked to me as well. They were simply looking for answers but had no leads to follow. We were not going to reveal any information, so none of us said that she had attempted to damage the company and was persuading other employees to go. If we had, they would have had a reason to arrest Joe or develop a case against him, assuming they hadn't already. The case stayed cold for almost 5 months. Before Kim's family in China engaged a private investigation team, they began working the case and asking questions. They were able to get some Chinese employees to speak about how Kim had attempted to persuade them to leave the company and join her. Kim's acquaintances mentioned that she was unhappy in her marriage and wanted to leave Joe. The private detectives created enough probable cause to pique the interest of the local newspaper, which was most likely funded by her family in China. They published regular reports on Kim's narrative in order to put pressure on the police and the DA, as well as generate public attention, so the DA would handle the matter. The police eventually obtained some of the evidence gathered by the hired private investigators, including records of her trips, purchases, interview transcripts, and information from her affair partners. This time, some employees were taken into the police station, increasing the pressure to speak. They later discovered that before she went missing, Joe notified me and the 2 managers that she was attempting to destroy the company, and I was instructed to travel to China to fix the damage. When I was summoned for interrogation, I arrived with a lawyer and refused to provide any information to aid the inquiry, since I did not want to incriminate myself. They asked for a statement from me since they knew I was close to Joe and Kim. They tried to intimidate me by telling me I was a suspect and an accessory to the crime, as if I felt guilty because I had hired a lawyer. In the back of my mind, I had a hunch Joe had done something to Kim, but I refused to believe it. They eventually gave up on getting a statement from me but continued to harass me by arresting and releasing me within 24 hours, as well as showing up at my employment. I don't know the specifics, but they obtained a warrant to search Joe's home again and confiscated some items. Missing posters of Kim could be found on bulletin boards across town, assuming she had died. They were looking for information that could lead to an arrest and a reward. The police inquiry continued for an additional 6 months. It was 6 months of torment since the news media and some publications were constantly pestering us at our office, attempting to obtain a statement. I was certain that some of them were forged and paid for by Kim's family. This had a negative impact on some of our staff, and the company began to lose individuals. 6 months later, things had cooled down. Throughout those 6 months, I also communicated with Joe, and we spent a lot of time together. He seemed to be aware of this. I knew he had something to do with her disappearance, so I didn't have to question him about whatever transpired between them. I tell myself to sleep easy at night that this woman was attempting to take food off my children's tables and destroy a firm I had worked hard to develop. She deserved everything she got. After 6 months, the DA did not want to pursue the case to trial since they only had circumstantial evidence and hearsay. They might get it past a grand jury if they're lucky, but he could be acquitted in a trial if further evidence came to emerge later. The case would be over, so they chose to wait for more proof, and the matter was placed in the cold case department for now. Things picked up at the company, and it appeared that we had weathered the storm. About a year later, my wife contacted me at the airport as I was ready to catch a flight out of the country. She urged me to turn on the local news. I reminded her that I was at the airport and that only CNN was on, so she should let me know what was going on. She stated that about 2 weeks ago, a jogger discovered some human remains spread throughout an area. It appears to have been excavated by some animals. They discovered a skull and the dental records matched Kim's. I quickly abandoned my flight and contacted Joe, but he didn't answer. Joe's lawyer shortly contacted to advise me that he had been arrested. His bond was set at $300,000, and we quickly released him as soon as the judge permitted. Long story short, I spoke with Joe, who informed me that it was an accident. What happened was that she informed him that she was leaving him and bringing their daughter to China. He resisted and shoved her, causing her head to hit the wall and collapse. She subsequently recovered, and Joe assisted her to the couch where she lay down and continued to talk, but not loudly. She told him she'd take their daughter and lay on the couch to recover from her concussion. Joe stated that he even brought her a blanket since she refused to go inside the bedroom. He considered taking her to the hospital, but he was scared the cops might get involved. He assumed she'd be all right by morning. The next morning, he returned to the living room and discovered that she had died. He realized she was leaking from the back of her skull. His story matched the coroner's report of a minor fracture on the back of her head, blunt force trauma. The coroner said it was unclear whether the force caused her death, but she may have bled out. Following the trial, he was found guilty of second-degree manslaughter, and the jury recommended 20 or more years in jail. As I write this, he has already spent 3 months of his sentence, and we are preparing to appeal his case. Joe has signed over the majority of his business to me, and I have promised to look after his finances. I'm currently in a custody dispute with Kim's parents because we want to adopt their 5-year-old kid. That's what Joe wanted, and the girl grew up with my children, so I believe my home would be ideal for her. Edit. Following the events detailed in the original article, things took a dark turn, revealing a network of lies, duplicity, and groundbreaking forensic discoveries. The course of these events would alter the lives of everyone concerned indefinitely. Kim, a young mother and wife, mysteriously vanished in October 2019. Her husband, Joe, reported her missing the following day, citing suspicious circumstances. Instead of dialing 911, he called the non-emergency line, which raised significant concerns among detectives. Joe speculated that Kim may have fled with another guy, citing an alleged emotional affair with someone in China. However, Joe's actions and proof of a turbulent marriage swiftly shifted the emphasis to him. Investigators quickly discovered hours of taped disputes on the couple's phones, suggesting a very disturbed marriage. Joe's conduct during police questioning, in which he recalled taking leisurely drives rather than actively seeking his missing wife, heightened suspicions. On October 25, 2019, Joe was arrested for physical child abuse after bruises were discovered on their small daughter. This arrest allowed the police to keep Joe while they gathered additional evidence, including a peculiar script discovered in his flat that appeared to be designed to mislead the investigators. The case broke open in March 2021 when a hiker discovered Kim's skeleton remains in Rockbridge Memorial State Park, the same location where Joe proposed to her. This discovery marked a turning point. Joe's boots with muddy soles and juniper tree needles were among the evidence gathered. Christine Edwards and her team at the Missouri Botanical Garden tested these needles for DNA and found that they matched the juniper trees at the burial site. This novel application of plant DNA placed Joe on the scene where Kim's body was discovered, giving key evidence against him. Joe's trial started in November 2021. Faced with substantial forensic evidence, his defense argued that Kim's death was unintentional, the consequence of a push during an altercation that led her to fall and harm herself. However, the prosecution, led by then Boone County Prosecutor Dan Knight, produced a compelling case, including covert audio recordings of their arguments and forensic botanical evidence. The tapes revealed Joe's dominating and abusive behavior, which contributed to the premeditated murder. Joe was convicted of second-degree murder on November 11, 2021, following a 10-day trial. The jury did not believe the killing was premeditated enough to warrant a first-degree conviction, but they did agree that Joe was responsible for Kim's murder. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison, one for each year of Kim's life. Following the trial, Kim's friends and relatives described her as a compassionate, clever, and artistic person who was adored. Her sudden demise caused a major vacuum in their lives. The neighborhood also witnessed the sad impact on the couple's little daughter, who was forced to grow up without either parent as a result of the tragedy. The case received national attention, not just for its terrible elements but also for the innovative forensic procedures deployed. The use of plant DNA to solve the crime was unusual, and it demonstrated the novel methods that can be used in criminal investigations. This case serves as a grim reminder of the possibility of concealed violence in seemingly everyday lives, as well as the critical role of improved forensic technology in attaining justice. As Joe serves his sentence, the aftermath of this tragedy continues to impact the lives of people who knew Kim, ensuring that her memory and the lessons learned from her instance are preserved. For more information, see full stories and in-depth coverage from sources such as CBS News and local Missouri news sites who extensively covered the investigation and trial.